What does a surface-to-air missile sound like when it finds you? The men who lived through it never agree. Some said it was a bang. Others called it a thump, dull, heavy, like a car wreck heard from inside the car. A few said they heard nothing at all, just silence, then the instrument panel turning into Christmas lights. On the afternoon of October 19, 1967, an F-105 Thunderchief designated Carbine 3 was pulling off a target in Route Package 6, the most heavily defended airspace on Earth at that point in the war, when an SA-2 guideline detonated roughly 40 feet behind the aircraft. The warhead threw about 12,700 steel fragments in a pattern optimized to shred aluminum skin at closing speeds north of Mach 3. Several hundred of those fragments hit the aft fuselage and the single Pratt & Whitney J75 engine that kept 38,000 pounds of airplane in the sky. Hydraulic fluid, red hot 6,800 psi worth, sprayed across the engine bay and ignited. The Thud's flight controls went from stiff to gone in about 4 seconds. Major Leo Thorsness, flying nearby, watched Carbine 3's tail section start glowing cherry red. He keyed the radio. "Carbine 3, you're burning. Get out." The pilot's name was Captain Howard Williams. He had about 1 minute to live or eject, and the two options were separating fast. I'm still digging through the after-action reports and pilot accounts for the rest of this story. What happened in the seconds after ejection? What the ground looked like coming up? What was waiting? Hit subscribe so that finds you when it's ready. If you've read something or heard something about shootdowns over the north that most people haven't, drop it in the comments. And if this is the kind of thing you want more of, the like button helps. Williams reached for the ejection handle between his legs. The Martin Baker seat in the F-105 was a brutal piece of engineering. A rocket-propelled sled that fired a man out of a disintegrating aircraft at acceleration loads up to 22 Gs. The seat was designed by a company whose entire founding philosophy boiled down to one idea: get the pilot clear of the airplane, keep him alive, figure out comfort later. Martin Baker kept a registry. Every pilot who survived using one of their seats got a tie and a membership number. By 1967, that number was somewhere past 3,000, but that's another story. Williams pulled the handle. The canopy blew off and the wind hit him at somewhere around 500 knots. At that speed, the air isn't air anymore. It's a wall. The ejection sequence slammed him upward, clear of the fuselage, and into a wind blast that dislocated his left shoulder and ripped his oxygen mask sideways across his face. His helmet visor shattered. The seat separated, the parachute deployed, and the sudden deceleration from seat speed to chute speed felt like being rear-ended by a truck. Below him, the Thud kept flying for another 11 seconds, trailing fire, nose dropping. No longer an aircraft, but a piece of ballistics, before it hit a karst ridge northwest of Hanoi and scattered wreckage across 800 meters of jungle. Williams was now hanging under a 28-foot canopy of nylon at roughly 10,000 feet above North Vietnam. The chute worked. The survival kit was still attached, his radio functional. He was, for the moment, alive and equipped. He was also drifting east, toward the Red River Valley, one of the most densely populated regions in Southeast Asia. Farmers in the paddies below had watched the entire engagement. Militia units, and there were militia units everywhere in Route Package 6. By late 1967, tens of thousands of armed civilians organized into local defense companies were already moving. The smoke from his crashed aircraft marked his general position better than any flare. 10,000 feet of altitude at a descent rate of roughly 18 feet per second gave him approximately 9 minutes before his boots hit the ground. 9 minutes of hanging in a harness, shoulder screaming, watching the landscape sharpen beneath him. The air defense network that killed Carbine 3 didn't exist 3 years earlier. In 1964, North Vietnam's anti-aircraft capability was negligible by modern standards. A scattering of 37mm guns, some radar-directed searchlights, a few obsolete fire control systems left over from the French War. An American pilot flying over the north in early 1965 faced roughly the same threat environment as a Korean War sortie. Annoying ground fire, mostly inaccurate, dangerous mainly at low altitude. Within 36 months, that same airspace would become the most lethal operating environment any pilot had ever entered. The Soviets built it. Not advisors offering suggestions, engineers with blueprints, shipping manifests, and a mandate from Moscow to construct a layered air defense system modeled on the doctrine protecting the Soviet homeland. The architecture was straightforward and extremely effective. Long-range early warning radar at the outer ring, acquisition radar at the middle ring, tracking, and engagement radar at the inner ring, with overlapping fields of fire from surface-to-air missile batteries and conventional anti-aircraft artillery filling every gap. The SA-2 guideline, NATO reporting name for the Soviet S-75 Divina, sat at the center of this system. A two-stage missile 35 feet long, carrying a 287-pound fragmentation warhead, guided to its target by a fan-song radar that could track an aircraft at ranges out to 60 miles. The missile itself could reach Mach 3.5. An F-105 doing 600 knots had roughly 12 seconds between launch detection and impact, but the SA-2 was only the headline. The thing that actually killed pilots en route Package 6 was the layering underneath it. North Vietnamese anti-aircraft artillery grew from around 700 guns in 1965 to more than 8,000 by 1967. 57mm, 37mm, 85mm, 100mm, every caliber the Soviet and Chinese arsenals could supply, arranged in concentric rings around bridges, rail yards, petroleum storage, and power plants. The geometry was deliberate. SA-2 batteries forced American aircraft down below 15,000 feet to avoid the missiles. Below 15,000 feet, the conventional flak started. Fly high, the missiles find you. Fly low, the guns find you. The system worked because each layer compensated for the weaknesses of the other. By late 1967, the numbers were staggering. More than 30 operational SA-2 sites ringed Hanoi alone, with another 15 around Haiphong. Over 200 dedicated fire control radars swept the skies in overlapping arcs. The North Vietnamese had more anti-aircraft guns per square mile than any country in history, more than Germany had defending Berlin in 1945, more than the Soviets had ringing Moscow during the same war. American intelligence analysts who compiled these figures kept using the word unprecedented. After a while, they stopped, because the density just kept increasing and the word lost its meaning. The crews flying into this knew the mathematics. 82 F-105. Thunder Chiefs were lost over North Vietnam in 1966. Another 74 in 1967. For a pilot assigned to Tak Ly or Korat in Thailand, flying a 100-mission tour over the north, the probability of being shot down, killed, or captured ran somewhere between 30 and 50%, depending on the period. No other American combat assignment in the 20th century carried odds that bad for that duration, and the system kept learning. North Vietnamese missile crews trained in the Soviet Union came home and adapted. They learned to fire missiles in salvos of 3, the first to force a maneuver, the second to predict it, the third to catch the pilot committed to his dodge. They learned to relocate batteries overnight, tearing down a site in 4 hours and rebuilding it 12 miles away before dawn. American pilots who had memorized SAM site locations from morning intelligence briefings would fly afternoon missions and find the sites empty, the missiles already shooting from somewhere else entirely. The fan-song radar operators learned to minimize their transmission time, flickering on just long enough to achieve a track solution, then going silent before American Wild Weasel aircraft could lock onto the signal and fire a Shrike anti-radiation missile back down the beam. The smell inside those cockpits was always the same. Sweat-soaked nylon harness straps, rubber from the oxygen mask, something metallic from the avionics bay baking behind the instrument panel, and the faint chemical bite of the cockpit pressurization seal. Aviation kerosene seeped into everything: the flight suits, the gloves, the seat cushion, the helmet padding. Pilots who flew the Thud said the airplane had a particular smell when it was working hard, a hot metal tang mixed with hydraulic fluid vapor that came through the bleed air system. You could taste it in the back of your throat at high G. Williams would have known that smell. Every pilot who flew Route Package 6 knew it. The 9 minutes he spent under that parachute canopy were the first minutes and hours when he couldn't smell the airplane anymore, just wind, and the faint green wetness of the valley rising to meet him. How fast is too fast to eject? The engineering answer is around 600 knots indicated airspeed. Above that, the wind blast alone can kill you. The human body at 600 knots meets air that behaves like concrete. Limbs flail backward with enough force to dislocate shoulders, snap femurs, tear helmets off heads still inside them. The Martin Baker seats installed in most American fighters of the era were rated for a maximum safe ejection speed that varied by model, but the F-105 seat was certified to around 525 knots. Williams went out somewhere around 500. He was lucky. Dozens of pilots who ejected above the rated envelope came back with compression fractures in their spines. The vertebrae simply crushed together under the acceleration, and some came back paralyzed from the chest down. The seat fired in a sequence that took about 1.4 seconds from handle pull to full chute deployment. In that window, the pilot experienced a rocket motor ignition that drove the seat upward along guide rails at an initial acceleration of 14 to 22 Gs, depending on the variant. The catapult charge alone generated roughly 40,000 pounds of thrust. For context, a Saturn V rocket at liftoff produced 7.5 million pounds of thrust but spread across 6.5 million pounds of vehicle. The ejection seat produced 40,000 pounds of thrust applied to a combined seat and pilot weight of around 350 pounds. Pound for pound, the ejection seat hit harder than a moon rocket. Spinal injuries were so common that the Air Force kept a separate medical category for them. Compression fractures at T12 and L1, the thoracolumbar junction, where the rigid thoracic spine meets the flexible lumbar spine, showed up in ejection after ejection. Flight surgeons at the Aerospace Medicine Division tracked these with the kind of statistical obsession that belongs in an actuarial office, not a war. Pilot height mattered. Sitting position mattered. Whether the man had time to assume the correct posture, spine straight, head back against the headrest, chin tucked, arms pulled in tight against the chest, mattered enormously. Most combat ejections happened with no time to prepare. The airplane was on fire, or coming apart, or in an unrecoverable spin, and the pilot grabbed the handle in whatever position his body happened to be in at that instant. One study from the Aerospace Medical Research Laboratory at Wright-Patterson found that ejections performed in the correct posture produced serious spinal injury about 11% of the time. Ejections in poor posture pushed that number past 30%. Williams pulled the handle with one hand while the airplane was rolling. His spine survived. His left shoulder did not. The wind blast caught his arm before he could tuck it and wrenched the joint out of its socket with a force no medical report bothered to quantify. His shoulder was still screaming when the wind caught the canopy and jerked him upright. The parachute oscillated, a slow, nauseating pendulum swing that moved Williams back and forth across a 40-degree arc beneath 28 feet of nylon. Every swing loaded the risers against his dislocated shoulder. The harness dug into his thighs and chest in alternating waves of pressure as his body weight shifted. He could hear the canopy breathing above him, the fabric pulsing with each oscillation, a soft rhythmic thump like something alive. Below that sound, nothing. The jet engine noise was gone. The radio chatter was gone. The cockpit was gone. He was hanging in open air over a country that wanted to kill him, moving in whatever direction the wind decided, and there was not a single thing he could do about any of it. The survival schools at Stead Air Force Base in Nevada and later at Fairchild taught pilots what to do under a canopy. Check the chute, inventory injuries, activate the rescue beeper, establish radio contact, steer toward favorable terrain if possible, a ridge, a tree line, anything that offered concealment on landing. Select a landing spot, prepare for a parachute landing fall. The training assumed a pilot who was uninjured, calm, and descending over terrain that offered options. Route Package 6 offered none of these. The Red River Delta below Williams was flat, wet farmland, cross-cut with dikes, paddies, irrigation canals, and village clusters every few hundred meters. Nowhere to hide, nowhere to blend in. The parachute, white, 28 feet in diameter, was visible against the afternoon sky from miles away. Every farmer and every paddy within visual range could see exactly where he was and compute exactly where he was going to land. Williams could see them too. The parachute descent did not spare the pilot any of this. He had eyes. He could watch the ground resolve from green blur into individual fields, then individual dikes, then individual people standing on those dikes looking up at him. Rescue was theoretically possible. The Air Force maintained dedicated combat search and rescue assets, HH-3, Jolly Green Giant helicopters staged at forward bases in Laos and Thailand with a 1 Sky Raider escort aircraft for suppression of ground fire around the pickup zone. The system worked. It had pulled pilots out of extraordinarily hostile situations, but the system needed time. A typical CSAR mission required 30 to 90 minutes to scramble, transit, locate the survivor, suppress local defenses, and execute the pickup. Williams was descending at 18 feet per second into a populated valley less than 60 miles from downtown Hanoi. The arithmetic was cruel. He had maybe 7 minutes of descent left. The nearest Jolly Green was 45 minutes away at best. The helicopters were not going to reach him before he hit the ground. Everyone involved, Williams, the orbiting flight lead, the CSAR controllers monitoring the frequency, knew this simultaneously and said nothing about it on the radio. What the radio carried instead was position reporting. Williams keyed his survival radio and transmitted his coordinates as best he could estimate them. A rough position based on where the flight had been when the missile hit. Adjusted for drift, the orbiting fighters copied. Somewhere a controller logged the information. The system processed the data with bureaucratic efficiency, while the man the data described drifted lower at the speed of a slow elevator, smelling wet earth and vegetation, now instead of hydraulic fluid, hearing dogs barking in a village below and to the east, watching figures moving along a dike road in his direction, 3 at first, then 5, then more. They were carrying things. At that altitude he could not tell what. Farm tools and rifles looked similar from 2,000 feet. The people on the ground had no such ambiguity. A burning aircraft and a white parachute were familiar sights in Route Package 6. The area produced American survivors on a near-weekly basis by late 1967, and the local defense militia had refined their response into something close to routine. Williams crossed below 1,000 feet. The ground was close enough now to see faces. 60 seconds. That was the window. The landing itself was a controlled disaster. A parachute landing fall assumes 2 good arms, bent knees, and a willingness to collapse sideways into the ground in a specific rolling sequence that distributes impact across the calf, thigh, hip, and back. Williams had one functional arm. The patties were soft, ankle-deep water over clay mud, which saved his legs but turned the PLF into an ugly sideways crumple that buried his dislocated shoulder into the muck. The pain would have whited out everything else. Somewhere in that first second of ground contact, training was already fighting shock for control of his nervous system. Shock was winning. The checklist existed. Every pilot who went through survival school carried it in memory like a prayer. Collapse the canopy so it stops advertising your position. Disconnect the risers. Get the survival radio out and confirm contact with orbiting aircraft. Retrieve the survival kit from the seat pan, assuming it stayed attached during ejection, which it often didn't. Orient yourself. Move. Get away from the landing site because the landing site is where they saw you go down, and that is exactly where they are headed right now. In theory, this sequence took 30 to 45 seconds. In practice, with injuries, with shaking hands, with adrenaline so thick the fingers won't close properly around buckle releases designed for calm hands in a classroom, the sequence took longer. Sometimes it took forever. Some pilots never completed it. The canopy was the immediate problem. 28 feet of white nylon spread across a rice paddy is visible from a mile in every direction. Williams needed to collapse it, bundle it, stuff it under water, or drag it into vegetation. One arm, mud to the ankles. The fabric catches wind even in light breeze and fights you. It's designed to catch air. That's the entire point of the object. And now that same engineering is working against the man it just saved. Pilots who made it back described wrestling their chutes in language that sounds like hand-to-hand combat. One man said it took him 2 full minutes, and he finally just sat on it. The figures Williams had watched from altitude were closer now, much closer. The local militia, Dan Kwan Dukich, the village self-defense force, operated under standing orders from Hanoi that were specific and well-rehearsed. Capture the pilot alive if possible. The bounty for a live American aviator varied by province and period, but was substantial enough to motivate. These were not regular army troops. They were farmers with weapons, organized at the village level, and they knew the terrain the way a man knows his own kitchen. Every paddy dike, every tree line, every drainage ditch. The American did not. The American was standing in a rice paddy in a flight suit the color of nothing found in nature, bleeding, one arm useless, trying to collapse a parachute with the coordination of a man who had been shot out of an airplane 90 seconds ago. The survival radio was the one thing keeping him connected to rescue, and the one thing most likely to get him caught. Transmitting gave the orbiting fighters a voice to home on, proof of life, confirmation of position, the essential first link in the CSAR chain. But the militia had learned to listen for the distinctive whine of the emergency beeper. The sound carried across open paddies. It told them the pilot was conscious, functional, and standing still long enough to operate a radio. Some pilots kept transmission to a bare minimum, a few seconds of position, then silence. Others couldn't stop talking. The radio was the last connection to a world where someone might still come get you, and letting go of the transmit button felt like releasing a rope over a drop you couldn't see the bottom of. Williams transmitted. The orbiting flight lead answered, and the first 60 seconds were already gone. They came from 3 directions at once. Williams was still on his knees in the paddy when the first hands grabbed the harness straps and yanked him backward. The mud released his boots with a wet sucking sound. Someone was shouting in Vietnamese, short clipped commands, and then more hands on his arms, his neck, his helmet. They pulled the helmet off. The sweat underneath hit open air and went cold against his scalp. The hands didn't stop. They found zippers, pockets, the survival vest, the radio. The radio went first. A man in dark clothing jerked it from his grip and held it up like evidence, still squawking with the flight lead's voice asking for a status update that would not come. The flight suit came off in pieces, not carefully, pulled, torn where it caught on gear attachment points, stripped down to his undershirt and shorts in maybe 15 seconds by people who had clearly done this before. The G-suit went, the survival vest went. His boots stayed on, which was unusual. Most captured pilots lost their boots immediately, and several later said the barefoot march was the detail that broke something in them before the camps even started. Williams kept his boots. The records don't explain why. Then the hitting began. The first blow came from behind, a rifle butt between the shoulder blades that drove him face first into the paddy water. He came up spitting mud and blood. The crowd had thickened. 20 people, maybe 30, women, older men, teenagers. American bombs had been falling on this province for 2 years by late 1967. The steel fragments of cluster bomb casings were still embedded in the dike walls of some of these paddies. The people standing around Williams had buried neighbors. They had rebuilt houses. Some of them had buried children. The man kneeling in their rice paddy had fallen out of the same sky those bombs came from, and he was wearing the same uniform as every other pilot who had dropped them. The distinction between this particular pilot and the war itself did not exist at the village level. Nobody was interested in making it. They marched him along a dike road toward the nearest village. Hands shoved him forward. When he stumbled, frequently, because his shoulder made balance nearly impossible and the dike paths were narrow and slick, someone hit him again. The smell was paddy water and wood smoke from cooking fires, cut with something sweet and rotting he couldn't identify. A woman spat on him as he passed. A boy threw a rock that caught him above the right eye. Blood ran into the eye and he couldn't wipe it because his arms were being held. The village appeared ahead as a cluster of tile roofs and banana trees, and from inside it Williams could hear more voices, a rising sound, the noise a crowd makes when it knows something is coming. The orbiting fighters could hear none of this. Their radios carried only silence from Williams's last known position. The flight lead made 2 more calls. No answer. He logged the time and turned south toward the tanker. You go in knowing you're probably not coming back out. That was a Jolly Green pilot. His name appears in one oral history collection and nowhere else, describing a Route Package 6 pickup. The helicopter crews said things like this without drama. The math justified it. An HH-3E Jolly Green Giant cruised at 140 knots. The SA-2 guideline missile traveled at Mach 3.5. The helicopter's defensive armament was 2 side-mounted 7.62mm miniguns. The North Vietnamese had radar-directed 57mm batteries, ringing every approach corridor worth using. Nothing about that math was close, but they went anyway. The Aerospace Rescue and Recovery Service stationed its Jolly Green detachments at Nakhon Phanom and Udorn in Thailand, with forward staging at Lima sites in Laos when the mission required it. The crews sat alert in rotation, 2 helicopters, Low Bird and High Bird, with a pair of A-1 Sky Raider escorts loaded with cluster munitions, white phosphorus, and 20mm cannon. When a pilot went down, the alert shack telephone rang and everyone ran. Takeoff inside 15 minutes was standard. Transit time to Route Package 6 from the nearest staging point ran 40 to 60 minutes depending on weather, routing, and how many SAM rings they had to fly around instead of through. The pilot under that parachute did not have 40 to 60 minutes. Everyone knew this. The helicopters launched anyway, because the alternative was not launching, and the Jolly Green crews had decided collectively, and without much discussion, that the alternative was unacceptable. The Low Bird went in first, down to treetop level, following rivers and ridgelines to mask the radar signature, the PJs in the back already rigged on the penetrator hoist, the door gunners scanning the tree lines below for muzzle flashes. The High Bird orbited above, far enough away to survive if the Low Bird took a fatal hit, close enough to attempt the pickup itself if it did. The Sky Raiders rolled in ahead of both, putting ordnance on anything that looked like a gun position within a mile of the survivor's last known coordinates. You could feel the noise in your fillings. The helicopter vibrated so hard at full power that crew members described feeling it in their teeth, in their vision, a whole-body tremor that made fine motor tasks nearly impossible. Between 1964 and 1973, the Air Force launched over 3,000 CSAR sorties into hostile territory. They recovered just under 1,000 aircrew. 45 rescue aircraft were lost. The para-rescue men, the PJs who rode the hoist down into the jungle, took the highest casualty rate of any Air Force specialty in the war. The going and knowing part was not metaphor. 4:17 a.m. local time. The truck stopped. Williams heard the gate before he saw it. A iron-on-iron grinding that echoed off stone walls and came back sounding older than anything he had ever heard. The French built Maison Centrale in 1896 as a prison for Vietnamese political dissidents. 71 years later, the Vietnamese were using it to hold the men who bombed them. And if anyone in Hanoi appreciated the symmetry, the records don't reflect it. The truck bed smelled of diesel and old fish sauce, and the copper penny taste of his own blood, which had been running from the cut above his eye for 6 hours, and had dried in a crust that pulled when he blinked. Someone grabbed his collar and hauled him over the tailgate. His boots hit cobblestone. The air inside the compound was different, closed, damp, trapped between walls that had been absorbing human misery since before his father was born. They took him to a room, small, a concrete slab for sleeping, a bucket, a single bulb behind wire mesh that stayed on around the clock. The door was solid wood, reinforced with steel straps, and it closed with a sound that one Navy commander later described as the period at the end of every sentence you ever started. The lock engaged. Footsteps receded down a corridor. Then nothing. The silence in Hoa Lo was its own instrument, not empty but pressurized, thick with the breathing of men in adjacent cells who would not speak until they were sure the guards had passed. William stood in the center of his cell, wearing shorts and an undershirt, and boots he should not still have had, one shoulder swollen to the size of a grapefruit, blood on his face, and listened to absolutely nothing for what felt like a very long time. The tap code came later. Days later, maybe weeks. Time inside Hoa Lo lost its edges fast, which was the point. A captured Navy pilot named Carlisle Harris had taught the code to other prisoners in 1965 after remembering it from a training course he'd barely paid attention to. 5x5 grid, C and K sharing a square. 2 taps, pause, 3 taps, second row, third column. The letter H prisoners learned to tap on walls, on floors, through water pipes, with brooms during forced sweeping details. They tapped until their knuckles bled, and then they tapped with their elbows. The Vietnamese knew about the tapping. They punished it with beatings, with isolation, with ropes. The prisoners tapped anyway. What the tap code replaced was everything. The survival radio frequency Williams had transmitted on for 11 seconds in a rice paddy was gone. The flight lead's voice was gone. The sound of jet engines overhead, the sound that meant someone was still looking, was gone. In its place was a concrete wall and a man on the other side of it whose face you might never see, tapping out 3 letters at a time because that was as fast as the system allowed. The first message Williams received through his cell wall took 4 minutes to decode. It was 2 words long. Hang tough. He did. 5 years, 7 months, 14 days between the Iron Gate and the C-141 that flew him out of Gia Lam Airport in February 1973. The dislocated shoulder was never properly set. The cut above his eye left a scar he carried for the rest of his life. The tap code, he said later, was the only thing that kept him human. 387 men communicating through stone in a language their captors could hear, but never fully stop. The survival radio had promised rescue. The wall promised only company. Most days, company was the larger gift. Gia Lam Airport, 12 February 1973. The C-141 Starlifter sat on the ramp with its cargo door open and its engines running. Williams walked across the tarmac under his own power, which was more than some men managed. The man ahead of him needed 2 escorts. The man behind him was missing his left hand below the wrist. They boarded in order of shoot-down date. Longest held first, a protocol the senior ranking officer had insisted on, and Hanoi had accepted, one of the few points of agreement in the entire repatriation negotiation. 591 men came home through Operation Homecoming. Roughly 113 did not come home at all and would not. Their remains scattered across limestone karst and triple canopy and rice paddies in provinces whose names most Americans had already stopped trying to pronounce. The debriefings lasted months. Air Force Intelligence, Navy Intelligence, DIA, the Joint Personnel Recovery Center, Each wanted its own session, its own questions, its own tape recorder running on a metal desk in a windowless room at a facility the returnees were not supposed to name. The questions were specific. What radar frequencies did you observe? What interrogation techniques were employed? Describe the physical layout of your cell block. The men answered with precision that surprised their debriefers. 5 years of tapping through walls had given them an inventory of Hoa Lo more detailed than anything the overhead photography had produced. One returnee had memorized the guard rotation schedule for his entire cell block across a 14-month period. Another had composed, entirely in his head, a 200-page manuscript on prison construction materials. The intelligence hall was enormous, and most of it went straight into folders, stamped with classification markings that would not be downgraded for decades. Williams's shootdown was recorded in the 7th Air Force Tactical Loss Database as entry 767-November.